Scary telling.
I remember the day it all started. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the sun was shining down on the town of Millfield, where I lived with my family. It was a typical day, nothing out of the ordinary. But that all changed when the first wave of insects hit. At first, it was just a few here and there. I remember swatting at them as I walked to the grocery store, thinking nothing of it. But as the day went on, more and more insects appeared. They were everywhere, on the sidewalks, in the air, crawling up the walls of buildings. They were different from any insects I had ever seen before. They were larger, with wings that shimmered in the sunlight. And they seemed to be everywhere. As the day wore on, people started to panic. I could hear screams coming from all around town as people were bitten by the insects. I remember running back to my house, swatting at the insects as I went. When I got home, my family was already there, frantically trying to close all the windows and doors. We watched in horror as the insects descended our house. They were everywhere, crawling over the windows and doors, trying to find a way in. We could hear them buzzing outside, their wings beating against the glass. It was like something out of a horror movie. That first night was the worst. We tried to sleep, but every time we closed our eyes, we could hear the insects outside. It was like they were waiting for us to let our guard down so they could attack. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of my little sister crying. She had been bitten by one of the insects, and her arm was swollen and red. My parents tried to comfort her, but I could tell they were scared too. Over the next few days, the situation only got worse. The insects seemed to be multiplying at an alarming rate. They were everywhere, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. The town was in chaos, with people running through the streets, trying to avoid the insects. I remember feeling like I was living in a nightmare, like this couldn't possibly be real. But it was real. And it was only going to get worse. The second wave of insects was even worse than the first. It seemed like the entire town was swarming with them, and there was no escape. My family and I had barricaded ourselves inside our house, trying to keep the insects out. We had stocked up on food and water, but we didn't know how long it would last. The government had declared a state of emergency and placed the town under quarantine. No one was allowed in or out, and the townspeople were ordered to stay inside their homes and wait for further instructions. It was like we were living in a prison, and the insects were our jailers. At first, we tried to keep our spirits up. We played board games and watched movies, trying to pass the time. But as the days turned into weeks, the situation became more and more dire. The insects were relentless, and there seemed to be no way to stop them. The town was cut off from the rest of the world, and we had no idea what was happening beyond our little bubble. The radio was our only source of information, and it was grim. The death toll was rising, and the hospital was overflowing with patients suffering from severe allergic reactions. There was talk of bringing in outside help, but no one knew if it would be enough. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in our house began to mount. My little sister was scared all the time, and my parents were constantly arguing about what we should do. We tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder and harder. Every time we heard the insects buzzing outside, our hearts would race with fear. I remember one night, when we thought we were safe. We had just finished dinner and were settling down to watch a movie when we heard a strange sound outside. It was like the buzzing of the insects, but it was louder and more insistent. We turned off the lights and huddled together, waiting for the sound to pass. But it didn't pass. It grew louder and louder until it was like the insects were trying to break down our front door. We could hear them scratching and buzzing, and it was like they were right on top of us. We were paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do. The sound finally died down, and we were left in silence. But it was a silence that was filled with dread. We knew that the insects were still out there, waiting for their chance to attack. And we knew that we were running out of time. As the quarantine dragged on, hope began to fade. The insects were multiplying at an alarming rate, and there seemed to be no way to stop them. But then, one day, a team of scientists arrived in Millfield. They set up a makeshift laboratory in the center of town and began working tirelessly to find a cure. They were a diverse group of experts, including entomologists, chemists, and biologists. They worked around the clock, trying to identify the insects and develop a way to eradicate them. At first, their efforts seemed futile. The insects were unlike anything they had ever seen before, and they seemed to be immune to all known treatments and insecticides. But the scientists were determined, and they refused to give up. They worked with samples of the insects, trying to identify their weaknesses. They tried every known insecticide, but nothing seemed to work. They even tried using natural predators, but the insects were too powerful. The scientists were frustrated, but they refused to give up. Finally, after weeks of experimentation, they had a breakthrough. They identified a compound that seemed to repel the insects. It was a synthetic pheromone that mimicked the scent of their natural predators. The scientists were cautiously optimistic, but they knew that they needed to test it out in the field. They began to set traps around the town, using the pheromone to lure the insects in. It was a risky plan, but it was their only hope. They watched nervously as the traps filled up with insects, hoping that they had finally found a way to stop them. But it wasn't that simple. The insects were smart, and they seemed to be able to sense the danger. They began to avoid the traps, making it harder and harder to catch them. The scientists were frustrated, but they refused to give up. Finally, they had another breakthrough. They realized that the pheromone wasn't strong enough to attract the insects on its own. They needed to use a stronger, more concentrated form of the pheromone, one that would overwhelm the insects' senses and make them unable to resist. They worked tirelessly, developing a new formula for the pheromone. It was stronger and more powerful than anything they had ever used before. They set up a new trap, and this time it worked. The insects were lured in by the pheromone, and they were trapped inside a special container that would kill them all at once. The scientists watched in amazement as the trap filled up with insects, the first real progress they had made in weeks. But the victory came at a cost. The town was thrown into chaos as the swarm was lured into the trap. The townspeople watched in horror as the insects were eliminated, but they knew that it was only a temporary solution. They knew that there was still much work to be done if they were going to save their town. After the successful trap, the scientists began to develop a plan to eliminate the insects once and for all. It was risky, but they believed it was their only hope. The plan involved using the pheromone to lure the insects into a large containment chamber. Once inside, the insects would be trapped and then exposed to a deadly gas that would kill them all at once. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the best chance they had. The scientists worked tirelessly, setting up the chamber and preparing the pheromone. They knew that the insects were smart, and they would need to be careful not to give away their plan. They worked in secret, making sure that the insects didn't catch on. As the plan came together, the townspeople began to hear rumors about what was happening. They were scared, but they knew that something needed to be done. They trusted the scientists, but they were also afraid that the plan would make things worse. The day of the operation arrived, and the entire town was on edge. The scientists set up the pheromone, and the insects began to swarm towards it. It was like watching a horror movie, with the insects descending on the chamber like a cloud of death. The scientists watched nervously as the insects were trapped inside the chamber. They knew that the next step was the most dangerous. They activated the gas, and the chamber filled with a deadly mist. For a few moments, there was nothing. And then, suddenly, there was movement inside the chamber. The insects were fighting back, trying to escape. The scientists watched in horror as the insects began to break through the chamber walls, swarming out into the town. It was like something out of a nightmare. The insects were everywhere, attacking everything in sight. The scientists had underestimated their power, and now the town was paying the price. For a few moments, there was chaos as people ran through the streets, trying to avoid the swarm. The scientists scrambled to find a solution, but it seemed like there was nothing they could do. The town was under attack, and there was no way to stop it. But then, something amazing happened. The insects began to slow down, their movements becoming sluggish. It was like the gas was finally taking effect, and the insects were dying. The townspeople watched in amazement as the swarm was finally eliminated. It was like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders, and they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But the victory came at a great cost. The town was left in ruins, with buildings destroyed and people dead. The scientists were hailed as heroes, but they knew that they had only succeeded because of the sacrifices made by the townspeople. As the town began to rebuild, the memory of the invasion lingered. It was a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface. But the townspeople were resilient, and they knew that they would survive. They had faced the swarm of death and come out on the other side. The town of Millfield would never be the same after the invasion. The memory of the swarm of death would stay with us forever, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. In the aftermath of the invasion, the town was left in ruins. Buildings were destroyed, and many of our friends and neighbors were dead. It was a somber time as we mourned our losses and tried to rebuild our lives. The scientists who had saved us were hailed as heroes, and they continued to work on ways to prevent something like this from happening again. They studied the insects, trying to understand how they had managed to survive for so long. They looked for ways to create a more sustainable ecosystem, one that would not be so vulnerable to invasive species. But it wasn't just the scientists who were working to rebuild the town. The entire community came together, volunteering their time and resources to help those in need. We set up shelters for the homeless, and we worked together to clean up the debris from the storm. As time passed, the town began to recover. New buildings were constructed, and the scars of the invasion began to fade. But the memory of what had happened would never be forgotten. It was like a shadow that hung over the town, a reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond our sight. But we were a resilient community, and we knew that we would survive. We had faced the swarm of death and come out on the other side. We were stronger for it, and we knew that we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the years that followed, the town of Millfield became known as a place of resilience and strength. We welcomed visitors from all over the world, eager to hear our story and learn from our experiences. We share our knowledge and expertise, working to prevent future invasions from destroying other communities. And through it all, we never forgot the sacrifices that had been made. We honored the memory of those who had lost their lives, and we worked to ensure that their legacy would live on. The invasion had changed us, but it had also shown us what we were capable of. We were a community that could face anything, and we knew that we would always stand together, no matter what the future held.